but we're going to go into our next session. So we told our tribal students free food, so they all showed up. Hey, just kidding. No, some of them have classes, so we told them to come when they were able to. And so I forced my tribal government class to be here. So thank you for staying and sticking through it. One of the programs that we have is actually called the Native American Summer Institute. And we're going on our 7th year this year. And so we are hoping that, we can reach out to some of the panelists to either speak with our students. School of Energy hopefully will be able to do a session. We're growing. Initially, we were supported by the health science program. That's kind of changed. And then the president's office was supporting our summer program. And then he no longer supports that program. And so now we're kind of trying to collaborate with other partners and other programs. And so Renette, she just walked out. She kind of oversees that, and I help recruit some of the programming for that. And like I said, we are in our 7th year, and this past year, we actually had 4 graduates that were at the first Native American Summer Institute. And a lot of these students are first generation students. So coming to the university was a great opportunity for them to get a glimpse of what college life is. And just in following up with some of the students, I was like, what did you think of the Summer Institute? And they said, I never thought of going to college. And they said, once I got there, I didn't want to leave. So we're seeing a lot of success, whether they're here at CWC or another community college throughout Wyoming. And this is really allowing our tribes to connect with our students, bringing in some tribal mentors. I think, when students see someone like them, they pay attention. So when we go into the classrooms, a lot of times, K through 12, the teachers are like, they never listen, and then when tribal speakers come in, they're quiet and they're like, that's the first time they sat still. And so really having those partnerships and working with some of our tribal programs has been really key. That since I've been here, I started a program when I was at Central Wyoming College for our natural resource management on Western Indian reservations, of having guest speakers, the different tribal programs around energy, around natural resources, giving our students it's an outdoor class, place-based education. They're not in the classroom, but bringing in tribal resource managers to talk about the day-to-day jobs. What are they doing day-to-day? We've had success with some students had no interest in STEM, but because of this class and because of the Summer Institute, we now have a few students that are finally enrolling in the STEM field. So, those are kind of some of the programming that we're trying to do, is to really keep our students connected. Because a lot of times when our students come here to University of Wyoming, as freshmen, we're like, what do you want to do? They say, I want to get educated to help my people. We're like, well, what degree? They're like, I don't know. I just want to help my people. And so, we have mentoring programs, and, I specifically mentor STEM students through some of the grant work. And, it's been successful that we've reached out to tribal partners. And I know we have some of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife people here. That I had a student that was getting his wildlife biology degree, and he was unsure if he wanted to do vertebrates, invertebrates. And I said, can you give him experience working with both? And so after that, he was like, okay, I'm working with vertebrates. He ended up working with the Migration Initiative, which is a state and federal partnership. But unfortunately, he did 1 year of grad school and left. And so I reached out to a tribal partner, the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative, and said, okay, we have some funding, a gap year fellowship. Can he come and work with you? And he's like, and I explained the situation, and a lot of our tribal students are site-based. And they said, well, we'll be able to, he can work at the Buffalo Initiative, but he has to go back to college. And so we've been able to work with our tribal partners, with the Ag College, with the Hobbs School. And fortunately, this year, we now have 2 of our graduate students at the Wind River Buffalo Initiative that are taking their classes hybrid. So that's one of the things here at UW. We're not quite fully hybrid. So we're hoping that in the future, I know there is that discussion coming up in the next week to be hybrid, to be able to provide some of this coursework to tribal students that, have to work to support their families. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the Gina Guy Keynote on Government Service, launched in 2022 as part of the Landscape Discussion on Energy, Law, and Policy Conference. The keynote has become an annual opportunity to recognize and celebrate legal professionals who have dedicated a significant portion of their careers to public service. The keynote is named for Gina Guy, a 1975 graduate of the University of Wyoming College of Law. Guy spent decades of service as a lawyer for the U.S. Department of the Interior. This year's Gina Guy's keynote speaker is none other than Senator Affie Ellis. As we mentioned earlier, Affie Ellis is a state senator representing Wyoming's 8th District in Cheyenne and a shareholder with the law firm Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. She currently serves as the Senate chairman of the Select Committee on Tribal Relations. Additionally, she serves on the several committees and select committees, including Travel, Recreation, Wildlife and Cultural Resources, Minerals, Business and Economic Development, Select Federal Natural Resource Management, Select Water, and Select Blockchain, Financial Technology, and Digital Innovation Technology. Ellis is the Senate co-chairman of the bipartisan Wyoming Women's Legislative Caucus, which organizes an annual Leap into Leadership conference to encourage women to run for office. As a state senator, she has worked on legislation related to a variety of Native American issues, including enactment of laws to address epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, MMIW, and a state Indian Child Welfare Act law. She's passionate about improving education in Wyoming, supporting legislation for the passing of computer science standards for all K-12 students, expanding scholarship opportunities for career and technical education students, and establishing a scholarship to provide financial assistance for adult learners to fill workforce needs. Please join me in welcoming Senator Affie Ellis.
Good afternoon, and thank you everyone again for being here. She'et de behlishini nishli tabahi bashishchin mai deshkizni dashishche bitani dashinali. Hey. It is my pleasure to provide remarks in recognition of a distinguished University of Wyoming alumni, Gina Guy. My remarks to you today are about public service, a topic I've thought a lot about as I near the end of my second term, having almost completed 8 years in the Wyoming Senate. I am very appreciative of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources' acknowledgement of people like Gina Guy, who devoted their life to public service. Some of you may have known Gina. I did not. She had a long, distinguished career and served as a regional solicitor in the Department of Interior in both Portland, Oregon, and in the Rocky Mountain region in Denver. In preparing my remarks today, I learned that Gina graduated from the University of Wyoming Law School in 1975, and she was only one of 3 women in her graduating class. Think about that, one of 3 women. I did not know Gina, as I mentioned, but after reading about her and learning more about her extraordinary career, the more I thought about my first year serving in the Senate, where there were only 3 women serving. I ran for the Wyoming legislature in 2016, and it's a bit of a well-worn story for those of you who know me, but I had taken my 8-year-old daughter to watch the Senate debate, and at the time our Capitol was being renovated, so we were in a very flat building, and so looking into a fish, we called it the fishbowl, looking in the fishbowl, my daughter looked into the Senate chamber, and she didn't see any women sitting in the senators' desks. So she asked me, "Mom, do they allow girls to be senators?" And I told her, "Of course, sweetheart. There's one woman right there. One." Her name is Bernadine Kraft, and Bernadine was the only female senator serving from Sweetwater County at that time. And Bernadine had just announced that she was not going to seek re-election. And so my daughter's innocent question really stuck with me for weeks as I thought about the possibility of having no women serving in the Senate. And it was definitely part of the reason I decided to run. Some of you may know that Wyoming is the equality state. We were the first state to unconditionally guarantee women's right to vote. I might digress a little bit on this point, but I'm very proud of the fact that Wyoming is not only affirmed this right, but it continued to lead into suffrage. It appointed Esther Hobart Morris in 1870 as the first female judge in the United States. Consequently, Wyoming had the first female bailiff. We later had the first all-female town council in Jackson Hole in the 1920s, and later our first female governor in the United States, Nellie Taylor Ross. So for a state with so many firsts for women, I couldn't fathom the notion of a Wyoming Senate with no female representation. And so I do what Western women do best. I got to work and I put together a campaign. When I ran, Wyoming was still, at least in my race, a bit like Mayberry. I challenged an incumbent who was an elderly gentleman, and we both ran pretty clean campaigns without a whole lot of mudslinging, something I wish I was seeing a little bit more of today. During the campaign, though, someone asked if Wyoming had ever elected an American Indian woman to serve in its legislature. And so we did a little research, and to the best of our knowledge, it hadn't. So when I took office in January of 2017, I was incredibly proud and humbled to have been the first Indigenous woman to be elected to serve in the Wyoming legislature. At the And we've made some strides. The year I was elected, there were 3 of us. Right now we have 7. And so depending on how the November election looks, I think we'll hold around that number. But my path to elected office was unlikely. I did not come from an affluent or a political family. My parents, Jim and Lenora Burnside, are both Navajo, or were both Navajo, and they grew up in Pine Springs, Arizona, and Crystal, New Mexico, respectively, which are both located on the Navajo reservation. Their families sent them to the Intermountain Indian Boarding School in Brigham City in the mid-1950s. Intermountain was an old Army hospital that was constructed during World War II. And the US Senator from Utah at the time had gotten millions of dollars sent back to his home district to convert this hospital into a school for Navajo kids in particular. The goal of the school was pretty clear. It was to assimilate these children, to have them abandon their culture, their language, and their religion. And looking at old papers that my mom had saved from her days at the Intermountain, my sisters and I saw old newsletters that were circulated on campus. These newsletters said something like, "Congratulations to the girls in dorm 19. Your supervisor didn't hear any of you speaking Navajo. Good job, girls." The school was sadly a success. Growing up, my dad had lost his ability to speak the language entirely. But fortunately, my mom retained some of the language and some of our cultural practices. She used to sing us lullabies in Navajo. But more often than not, when we misbehaved, she would say, "Shush biyajet." Loose translation, naughty little bear. When they graduated from the Intermountain School, my dad had found some work in Wyoming as a welder, and he loved the place. When he found Jackson Hole, he was in heaven. So my parents moved there in 1956, back when it was a rowdy cow town, and that's where they raised their family, with me being the youngest of 4 siblings. Growing up, I didn't think much about the fact that I was Navajo. It wasn't until kindergarten when I realized I was a little different. Before my first day of school, I remember my mom telling me, "Don't tell the other kids you're Navajo. People aren't always nice to Indians," obviously drawn from her experience in boarding schools. But sure enough, the kids found out about my ancestry, and during the fall of my first year of kindergarten, our teacher had us make pilgrim hats to celebrate Thanksgiving. Our group of kids chased me around on the playground, and I'll never forget it, and they said, "You can't be a pilgrim, you're an Indian." And so it was. I grew up with various iterations of this type of treatment, and it wasn't until I graduated high school, attended the University of Wyoming, and took a federal Indian law class that I began to understand the eras of federal Indian law and the policy that shaped my life as a Navajo girl growing up in Jackson Hole. And I realized I was living in 2 worlds. At the University of Wyoming, I took all the classes you could in the American Indian Studies department. Indians in film, Native American literature, anthropology, archaeology, but it was the federal Indian law class that really spoke to me. I knew I wanted to use that knowledge and my unique background to work in this field. So after I graduated, my first job took me to Washington, D.C. to work for U.S. Senator Craig Thomas, who was serving as the senior senator of Wyoming until he passed in 2017. Craig Thomas at the time had served as either the chairman or vice chairman of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, depending on which party was in the majority. And when I first moved to Washington, and this is for all you students out there, I had dreams of being a legislative aide, a legislative policy analyst. But given my age and inexperience, my first job was making coffee, answering phones, managing the interns, and giving tours of the U.S. Capitol to Wyoming visitors. But I loved it. I found that I loved giving Capitol tours in particular. The architecture and the artwork of that building reflect the rich history of our country and how our country has grappled to understand and articulate its relationship with Indian people and tribal nations. Within the Grand Capitol Rotunda, there's a painting called The Baptism of Pocahontas, and I used to look at it a lot. It was installed in 1840, and it was a curious choice because Pocahontas had preceded U.S. history by more than a century. She lived and died during the 1600s, long before the Revolutionary War and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. She had been largely forgotten in our country, but for the 1800s, she was often used to symbolize a good, obedient Indian. So if you ever visit Washington and tour the US Capitol, count how many times you see Pocahontas in the rotunda. I think the only person portrayed more than her is George Washington, but I could be wrong. Nevertheless, although I love giving Capitol tours, I did finally earn my stripes and advanced in the senator's office to work on policy, including federal Indian law. Aside from learning the issues, I took away other valuable skills about lawmaking and policymaking. For example, how to really listen to constituents, how to look at problems and brainstorm ideas that might solve those problems, how to identify and engage stakeholders, how to navigate a process, either regulatory or legislative or something else, to see if you could get an idea to become law. How not to give up when something goes wrong, because getting an idea to become law is really, really hard. But my favorite part was finding some success and being able to help constituents who had problems. For those of us who are drawn to public service, I think these are the reasons we do it. Since those early days of my career, I have continued to work in this area on law and policy, and the issues that affect Indian country are by far the most interesting and the most rewarding. For those of us who work in the space, and I know a lot of you in here do, I'm sure you've been asked if you've ever felt discouraged or if the problems facing Indigenous people are so challenging that it seems hopeless to even try to make a change. And I won't lie, early on in my career, I definitely had moments of frustration, and I didn't think I would ever be able to make a difference. But the more I've worked in this field, the more I've come to realize that so many of the challenges that we face as Indigenous people stem from hundreds of years of policy decisions that still affect our legal and cultural status today. And it takes time to unpack and unravel hundreds of years of law. Those laws that either were affirmatively passed by Congress or those decisions that were decided by the US Supreme Court. Sadly, many of these that are still on the books today presume that Native people are incapable of managing their own affairs. Like Pocahontas, sometimes it's easier for people to think of Indian people as relics of the past, as noble savages, as wards to the guardians. Troy Ide talked about this. That's the Supreme Court's words, not mine. Or something else. Those are CNN's words, not mine. Inside joke for those of you who pay attention to the news. I've been asked why Indian people still care about their treaties and their treaty rights. I'm always quick to respond. That's like asking any American why they care about the US Constitution and their constitutional rights. Why? Because we're still here. We have survived wars, disease, assimilation. Today, we have Indigenous doctors, teachers, engineers, entrepreneurs, lawyers, and policymakers. But I'd argue we don't have enough. While we've made these significant gains, we still have work to do to be seen as relevant stakeholders, with voices and viewpoints worthy of attention in policy decisions. When I took office in the Wyoming Senate, I had a general understanding of what to expect and how to hit the ground running, but it did take time to find my footing and to earn the respect of my colleagues. Looking back on these 8 years, I remember the first bill I worked on, the Indian Education Act for All, which required the State Board of Education in Wyoming to rewrite social studies standards to better educate Wyoming kids about Native American history and the contributions of modern-day Native Americans. Although the bill had already been in the works, supported by a dear friend of mine, Representative Lloyd Larson, the bill almost didn't pass in the Senate. As the deadline approached for the bill to be heard, the bill kept getting moved further and further down the list of bills we were considering. I asked my colleagues, what's going on with that bill? And I learned that some of the bill's sponsors had angered the majority floor leader. So he happily kept pushing the bill down on the list. I believed in the bill and respectfully confronted the majority floor leader and asked that the bill not be moved down the list any further and that it be heard before we adjourned. Fortunately for us, the majority floor leader honored my request and the act became law. I think about that sometimes. If I had stayed silent, that bill would have likely died. I'm glad I spoke up. After working on the bill, though, it really did highlight the fact that I didn't want to waste any of my time in the Senate. We pressed hard to tackle important bills, and I want to talk to you a lot about those bills, and they have not a lot to do with energy, but in the spirit of sharing information and dialogue, hopefully some of you can take these ideas back to your states and to your reservations. One of the first bills we worked on was passing a state version of the Native American Graves and Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA for short. NAGPRA was first enacted at the federal level in 1990, and it requires the federal government to return human remains found on federal property to the appropriate tribe. Although the bill was very important, it was limited because it was only applied to lands found on federal land. So we were able to pass a version of NAGPRA which applied to state and private lands. I worked with a senator closely from Converse County who represented landowner interests. We met with the tribal historic preservation officers from the Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone tribes. There was quite a bit of concerns about energy development in the Converse County area, a concern that continues today. Many of you may know that this area is also the home of Fort Laramie, an area that was home to dozens of tribes for hundreds of years. The law ensured that any remains would be treated with respect and returned to the appropriate tribe. Passing that bill was a good win for the tribes, and it was a good win for Wyoming. My work continued, and I eventually became the co-chairman of the Select Committee on Indian Affairs. Along with my co-chair, who I have to mention again, Representative Lloyd Larson, we tackled all kinds of issues. And I'm sad that you aren't standing here with me right now because this was a team effort. We passed bills to ensure that tribal members could participate in all kinds of state programs to address things like weed and pest infestation and to manage livestock contamination. We looked at K through 12 education, and we undertook a multi-year effort to address absenteeism and truancy. And as the work continued, so did the intensity of the issues we tackled. We took on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous persons. Again, another multi-year effort, which focused on a few key areas. First, we wanted to make sure there was better cooperation between Wyoming peace officers and the Wind River Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement. We also looked at Amber Alerts and how they were administered on the Wind River Reservation. I'll never forget reading an article that was in Wyoming public media, which said that there was no Amber Alert coverage. And so we dug in and learned about this very sad story of a young girl named Ashlyn Mike, who was a Navajo girl on the Navajo Reservation. She was abducted when she was 11 years old in 2016. She was coming home from school with her brother, and her brother managed to escape. Their family notified the authorities, but because of jurisdictional confusion, law enforcement wasn't sure who should issue the Amber Alert. Should it be tribal police, state police, or the FBI? Ashlyn was later found dead, leaving many to ask why it took so long to issue the Amber Alert, and recovering kids in those first few hours is the most critical. We studied the issue, and we knew we never wanted to have that happen in Wyoming to any of our Indigenous kids, and we acted. Our work also complemented the work of Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon and his Missing Murdered Indigenous Person Task Force. I remember attending a march here on this campus organized by Keepers of the Fire, an Indigenous student group that organized the march to raise awareness for the missing and murdered Indigenous person epidemic. At the event, I sat at a table next to Governor Gordon, and speakers were calling on him, asking him to create a task force. He leaned over to me and asked me what I thought. I told him that I would have legislation to help address the issue, and I had a few ideas in mind, and I thought we could make a difference. The task force he ultimately convened included some very talented individuals who I have loved working with over the years. This group has produced a report which highlighted not only that Indigenous people were missing and murdered at disproportionate rates, but that they were also lacking significant media coverage. And I do see some reporters in the office or in the audience. And so I'd ask you to take a look at that report. The report garnered national attention after a beautiful young blonde woman named Gabby Petito went missing in Wyoming. National news outlets covered the story intensely until she was ultimately found dead. What happened to Miss Petito was tragic, but it also highlighted how poorly the media reported on stories of young Indigenous women who went missing. And things started to change. To my point earlier, I don't think we have solved all those problems, but we have made strides, and I do think things are getting better. I think about the day of the MMIP March, and I have to also reflect on the fact that for a kid that just grew up in Wyoming and didn't have much prospects of ever getting a college degree or ever getting to work in these jobs, how humbling it was for me to have the governor of Wyoming ask me for my advice and my help. There aren't words to ever convey how much I have appreciated these opportunities over the last 8 years. This work, however, hasn't been easy. I was recently at a conference, and I was talking to another Indigenous state senator from Montana, and he was talking about Wyoming's recent effort to codify the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, into state law. And specifically, he said to me, "You guys passed that easy." And I laughed. I said, of all the words I could ever use to describe that effort, easy would not be one of them. For those of you who don't know, ICWA is a federal law which provides a preference for Indian children who are facing separation from their parents to be placed with their tribal relatives or other members of their tribe. For decades, thousands of Indian children were placed with non-Indian families, with state court stop and call on ICWA's protection to apply, but under the cover of state law rather than federal law. And so getting ICWA codified in Wyoming was one of the most challenging experiences I've had in the Wyoming legislature. I shared my parents' boarding school stories. My mom had been severely mistreated at a boarding school she attended on the Navajo Reservation. And many of my Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone friends traveled to Cheyenne to testify about their experiences of assimilation and their families being torn apart before ICWA became law. And I want to acknowledge my good friend, Northern Arapaho Councilwoman Karen Returns to War. She testified both on the House and Senate side and has a particularly sad story with a happy ending about how ICWA affected her life and why it mattered so much. So when I think about it, easy, that was not the word, but it was very rewarding to get done. And I think that's what I'm going to miss the most about these last 8 years of public service. The work has been so meaningful. This last year, I was hoping to maybe start breaking up with some of this work, but like a moth to a flame, I think I've actually worked harder to try and button up things and get more things teed up for this next session. So our Select Committee on Tribal Relations has been working very hard. I think we're having finally having some very productive conversations with the University of Wyoming about the cost of tuition and attendance. We're working to resolve a collection of online state sales tax from tribal members who have been having their items delivered to the reservation. In my view, and it's taken us a while to even acknowledge this has been a problem, Wyoming has been impermissibly collecting this tax for some time, ever since we passed some of our online sales tax collection laws. And so we're getting there. And we've been looking at ways to protect rock art images, such as petroglyphs and pictographs. And this work has allowed us to tour some really exceptional places in Wyoming which have significant rock imagery. And as I've looked at those rock images, you can't help but think about why they're there and what they mean. We may never know the stories or meanings behind those images, but it's a reminder that mankind has always searched for ways to leave a mark on future generations. I've been asked what type of legacy I hope to leave for future generations, and I've really given this some thought. Serving in the Senate, I have spent many, many hours sitting in the Wyoming Capitol, and I've looked at composite pictures of past legislators. There have been many moments where I couldn't help but wonder, who was PJ Black? And what did he work on when he served in the legislature in 1926? What were the bills he sponsored? What were the issues he cared about? And I don't know. Someday, I think someone will see my picture in the Capitol and they might ask themselves the same question. Who was Affie Ellis and what were the bills she sponsored in 2023? No one will know. And that's okay, because the legacy that we leave are the actual laws that we work to pass. The policy choices that we made using our best judgment will be the legacy, and no one will be around to remember, and there'll be no one around to worry about taking credit. And I think that's a really good thing. So it's a difficult time in American politics right now. I think we all know that. As I mentioned, I ran a pretty Mayberry campaign in 2016, but the heat was there when I ran for reelection in 2020. And I know what it's like, negativity. It's sadly ineffective, and it really does sting. But if I had to do it all over again, I want to tell those of you that are thinking about running for public office at any point in your future careers, do it. It is so challenging, but so rewarding, especially you young people. You can make a difference. And so I will be riding off into the sunset in a few short months. And while I'm sad to leave behind an era of my life that has been devoted to public service, maybe I'm like a policy wonk version of Taylor Swift. I'm excited to start a new era. For the past 8 years, I've put my legal career on hold and I put a priority on my legislative service. I'm excited to be returning to the practice of law full time. I joined Brownstein almost 3 years ago, and Brownstein, for those of you who don't know, is a Denver, DC-based firm. I work in the natural resource and American Indian law practice groups. And I want to acknowledge some of my colleagues that are here, Jen Scoggin, Shane Schultz, Caitlin Castaneda, and another colleague of ours had to leave, Ruth Elizabeth Morris. She's in our Denver office. And then I also wanted to make available a colleague of ours who spoke at the petroleum conference earlier in August. His name is Mark Warren, and others in our DC office. These literally are the men that wrote Section 45 of the IRS code and are experts on 45Q. So to the extent there are questions, please come ask me, because we can put you in touch with some really leading experts in that area. I like practicing law for a lot of the same reasons I've been drawn to public service. I like helping people solve problems. One problem that I continue to see, though, time and again, is the disconnect between decisions that are made in Washington, D.C. from an understanding about what those impacts have for the rural American West, including Native American reservations. Wyoming's economy is similar to those of many Indian reservations, small population and vast expanses of land. These lands often contain rich mineral resources. For Wyoming, approximately 70% of our state's budget is supported by the mineral industry through severance tax, ad valorem, personal property tax, state sales tax. Those dollars build our schools and pay our teachers' salaries to educate our children. These lands provide jobs for thousands of men and women, and they keep our small communities going. These lands support outdoor recreation, extraordinary hunting and fishing, and at its most basic level, beauty. We breathe clean air and we can see the stars. I am so thankful to live in a state where the land provides so much for its people. And I know for those of you who live on Indian reservations, you feel the same way. Whenever I drive through the West, I love taking in the amazing landscapes and experiencing a kind of freedom that I never could when I lived in a big city. My mom taught me about the importance of harmony and balance in Navajo culture, harmony between ourselves, our communities, and the land. The concept of hojo, often translated as beauty or balance, guides our actions and decisions. This principle reminds us that our well-being is intertwined with the health of our environment. It is a profound responsibility we carry, especially when discussing issues such as energy development and environmental stewardship. So in conclusion, I want to say that while there are many differences between states and tribal communities, and I think we have a lot more in common than we might realize. And it was that goal in bringing us together today to learn from each other, to find some of those commonalities, and maybe band together to come up with some ideas to solve some of the problems that we face. So again, thank you to everyone for attending. I know that everyone here is so busy. It means a lot to me that you traveled here and spending your time with us. So hopefully we'll do it again sometime. And I just want to thank everyone again for your participation.
Aho, Senator Affie Ellis, for your inspiring remarks, for working so tirelessly for the citizens of Wyoming Indigenous communities.